1st, which means it's the beginning of Pride Month. And, this is a big value for us as a community that is inclusive and affirming of the LGBTQIA plus community. It's just something that we want to consistently acknowledge. And at the same time, I also want to acknowledge that it might not feel so celebratory this year, that this year's Pride Month, because so much change and upheaval in our world. And so as we talk today about optimism, we just want to keep our LGBTQIA plus family in mind and in our hearts. And of course, we're going to be exploring values in that world and in that sphere more as we go through this month. But we've been in this series called ETHOS, Sacred Values for a Struggling World. And how many of us resonate with the struggling part, right? That to be human is certainly a struggle. Any human life is hard, even in not so difficult times. But certainly as a collective, it feels that we are facing a massive sense of struggle and upheaval. And just so much change. And it feels as though every day, at least for me, every day it feels like we're trying to decipher what kind of movie we're living in right now, right? Like every day you get a new news story or you learn something new and you're like, are we in a horror movie or are we in a dark comedy? Are we in a satire of ourselves? Are we in a sci-fi movie? And it feels like all could be kind of true simultaneously because you look out, what was it? Oh, I thought maybe someone had another genre suggestion. It's just a phone going off. Okay. I'm open to ideas. But we look out at the world, and there's so much political upheaval, and we have things like climate change and economic injustice, and, talk about sci-fi, the growing influence of AI, and there's wars, and there's pressure of possible upcoming wars and a possible recession, and really fill in the blank for whatever might be closest to your heart, because in some ways it's kind of like apocalyptic Mad Libs, right? Fill in the blank, right? Do you remember Mad Libs? Okay, that was a favorite of mine growing up, long before cell phones. I don't think kids these days will ever get the appreciation of Mad Libs. It's such a beautiful car ride thing. Anyway, if you don't know what I'm talking about, Mad Libs, you filled in all the blank for these different adjectives and nouns, and then you got a story. So it's not at all having to do with angry liberals or anything. As I said it, I realized that's like another way you can interpret that. All right, we're off to a really interesting start today. Let's just figure this out. Okay. Jake, why are you starting on such a somber note? Is it because it's raining outside? No. I guess I felt a little interesting with the rain, right? It's like when we get that first rain, it's just a different feeling. But that is not why today is starting the way it is. And you might think, well, I come to Aldea to be cheered up. Okay, why are you starting on such a downer? Well, I just want to acknowledge all of these things in our world, in our lives that feel like unknowns. Because what do we tend to do? We blanket our future in fear and dread because it remains unknown to us. And yet when we do that, we start to mute or at very least turn the volume down on our hope. I remember being a kid, not that long ago, and I remember this feeling of, when you're a kid, your hope kind of threshold is so open, right? You're just always like super hopeful, and then things happen, and your hopes get dashed, and you feel super down, like maybe we're gonna get to go to McDonald's today. Oh, never mind, we're not. Oh, I feel so terrible. Or maybe I'm gonna go to my friend's birthday party. Oh, never mind, you got a little sick, you can't go. Oh no, and it's this really big roller coaster ride. And yet I remember this moment, and I feel like I was about 5 years old. I remember this moment where the thought actually occurred to me. And this is really sad to think about, and you might relate to this, but I remember the moment when the thought occurred to me, I can stop getting my hopes up, and I will never have to be disappointed, right? It's a genius idea, and it's actually really sad, because it's this moment when pessimism starts to enter into the conversation at a young age as a means of trying to get back some level of control in a life that feels out of control, especially when you're a kid and you really don't have any control. Right? And so pessimism enters our story at some point, and it presents as this option and this means for getting back control, and really this illusion of control. Because if you can't, if I already have my hopes dashed, then you can't do it for me, right? But the case I want to make today, the argument I want to present today, is that pessimism is not an option for those of us who are trying to fully embody and live in the human experience. I'm going to make that case today. And so if pessimism is not an option, then really the only option left is optimism. And that's going to be our value for today. But I want to be clear, it's not a naive optimism, but I'm calling it a sacred optimism. And in order to figure out what that means, I want to completely redefine it and reclaim it today. Now, you might be out there and you might be saying, Jake, if you are optimistic, then you must not be paying very good attention. And I understand that. And I feel that with you. And I'm not here to convince you of anything different than you already believe. I'm not here to list off things that are going right in the world, though there are things that are going right, but I'm not here to list those things off in order to overwhelm your list of things that are going wrong, because I don't think there's any hope of doing that. Nor am I going to just play a bunch of cute animal videos, which might cheer you up for a moment. You know, my favorite are the ones where like different species become friends. But no matter how many golden retriever plays with tiger videos I show you, it's not going to make a difference. I'm not trying to convince you to be an optimist where you aren't. What I'm actually hoping to do is to help you discover that there is an optimism latent inside of you already, and if we can just find it and rekindle that flame, then we're cooking with gas, all right? You with me? I want to start with a quote from author, civil rights activist James Baldwin. And I want to remind you that as he talks about optimism, not only is he African American during the civil rights era, he's also gay. And so he's on multiple fronts facing discrimination, facing suppression and oppression, and yet he says this about optimism: I can't be a pessimist because I'm alive. To be a pessimist means that you have agreed that human life is an academic matter, so I'm forced to be an optimist. What does it mean that we have agreed that life is an academic matter? Well, perhaps if we were to stand at a distance to human life, right? We were to stand at a distance from the human experience and analyze it and study it and theorize about it and philosophize about it, right? Then maybe you could say, well, you know, all we are as human beings are a collection of molecules that came together and, came together on this planet that happened to be able to support life, just statistically speaking. And then, we eventually evolved to become apes, which we are now. And then these apes tried their hand at building society, but it's really not going all that well. And if that's your perspective and you've reduced it to that, then friends, pessimism makes perfect sense. More power to you there, right? But here's what Baldwin's saying, and here's what I'm saying today. Pessimism is not an option because you and I are not simply standing at a distance to human life, analyzing it. We are human, right? We can't afford to remove ourselves from the equation because we are in it, friends. We are part of it. We are not just observing and studying it. We are living it, and so is your family, and so are your children, and so are your friends. This means that you and I have skin in the game, and so we cannot reduce it to an academic matter. It is a lived experience. You are more than just a collection of molecules, and so are your relationships, and so is your passion, and so are your values. And so from this perspective, I do not see pessimism as an option. What does that leave? Optimism, right? And you might be out there and you're saying, I can't do it, Jake. I can't do it. I've been able to get on board with you with a lot of crazy things. You've stood up here and you've talked about aliens, and I was more on board with you then than I was today about optimism. I can't do it, right? And so what I want to do today is I want to break down what I am saying when I use that word optimism. Because if I look at my own life and how I've so often thought about optimism, I've kind of thought about it as though I'm placing an emotional bet on how things are going to turn out in the future. Like I'm trying to figure out what's the over-under on if everything's going to be okay, right? And we decide, am I going to invest in the future or am I going to just not have any hope. And yet, I think that there is something deeper and truer and more pragmatic about optimism if we were to go back to the Greek and find its original meaning. It comes from this Greek word, optare. And this word means to choose, to desire, to hope for. And it shares the same root that we not only see in optimism, but we see in the word option. Option, of course, meaning the power of choice, to have options and to opt in or out of something. And I wonder if, just for a second, if we look at that root opt, we think about choosing something. We think about exerting our will to move in a particular direction. And I wonder if we think of optimism not simply as this passive experience, but an active decision and intention. Not as our best prediction onto whether or not things are going to be okay, but a strategy for living in the world, a choice. And Howard Zinn is an American historian who has looked really critically at the challenges that we have faced and really caused for ourselves as human beings, and yet he says this about hope. To be hopeful in bad times is not just foolishly romantic. It is based on the fact that human history is a history not only of cruelty, but also of compassion. Friends, what we choose to emphasize in this complex history will determine our lives. What we choose to emphasize, what we choose to see, what we opt into seeing. Yes, the world has a complex history. Yes, the world is complex today. And you know what? So are you. So do you have a complex history. But we all have the option of what we want to emphasize. We all have the option at which lens we are going to look through reality, right? Are we going to look through a lens of optimism or one of pessimism? I'm not here to say that one is right and one is wrong. I'm here to say that you always have the choice. You might say, well, look at how much war and needless suffering we've caused throughout the millennia. But you could also say, look at how much love and care was required for every single one of us to be here, for our ancestors to have made it through. Well, you could say, look at how slow we learn as a species, right? We're repeating the same mistakes over and over and over again. And yet, at the same time, you could say, well, we are learning. Every generation, we are learning, right? And you see it in each generation. There's something new that we're bringing to the table. And in the same way, you could look at your life. You could do the same thing. You could look at your life and you could say, look at all the pain that people put me through. Look at all that happened to me. And you can also say, look at all the ways that I've been blessed. Look at how even the worst of challenges were something for me to overcome and grow from. Look at all the ways I've been taken care of. Friends, I'm not asking you to ignore the pain or ignore the suffering, but I am reminding you that we all are writing our life story. We're all looking at our own history, and we're all continually editing and redrafting and writing our life story. And the question is it purely a tragedy, or are you on a hero's journey? A hero's journey where even the most difficult of times are part of your story, are how you learn, how you grow, and how you become a blessing to others. So the past is determined by how we choose to see it, and how we choose to see it determines our current experience. It determines our experience of now. Friends, do you hear that? The past is determined by how we choose to see it, and this determines our experience of the now. And perhaps the same is true of the future. The future which, for all of us, is about the unknown. It is completely unknown to us. At absolute best, we can make some predictions and projections, but that's really all the future is, right? Is our best attempts at a projection. And yet, sacred optimism is not about knowing the future. It is not about your best predictions. It's actually how you orient yourself, what you choose to see, what you choose to emphasize, and that emphasis being on hope. The French philosopher and mystic Teilhard de Chardin said, "The future belongs to those who give the next generation reason for hope." He did not say, "The future belongs to those who know the future or can predict whether it's going to be good or bad." He did not say, "The future belongs to those who have lowered their hopes and stood at a distance from human life in order to gain some sense of feeling in control." No, he said the future it really belongs to those who treat this life as something worth fighting for and something as precious, regardless of the outcome. Because friends, if our ancestors gave up when the odds were stacked against them, if any of our ancestors had done that, we wouldn't be here. Our history, your personal history, is filled with thousands of people who kept going when the odds were stacked against them. Maybe they had a similar outlook to Martin Luther, the person who ignited the Protestant Reformation. He says, "Even if I knew that tomorrow the world would go to pieces, I would still plant my apple tree today." I want to thank my friend John Ryder for sending me that quote. Sometimes I put out the newsletter and then people email me back with quotes and I'm like, oh, we're still a work in progress. Let's add this in. And I love this one so much because it makes me think, friends, what apple trees are you planting? What apple trees would you be willing to plant even if you knew that tomorrow would go to pieces? There's probably one apple farmer out there today who's like, usually messages at Aldea really feel like they were written just for me, but today especially. Here's the thing, we can never know what tomorrow holds. We can never have the guarantee that the world will not go to pieces tomorrow. I wish we could, but it is just not a part of the deal, I am sorry to say. So when you dream, when you have hope, you do it without the promise of tomorrow, but you do it anyway. You plant the apple tree without knowing that anything is guaranteed. And we know that you cannot bring anything into reality unless you have first envisioned it, unless you have first dreamed it. So will we allow ourselves to dream? Because perhaps dreams are the only way that we create the future. And to expand on this, I want to share a quote from Victor Hugo, the famous French, that's a good one. Say that, famous French author. Say that 5 times. Famous French author. You got it. Okay, cool. Go home and try that. That's how you're going to remember today's message. You're like, I'm not going to remember anything, but I remember famous French author for some reason. Victor Hugo, the famous French author, wrote, among the many wonderful books he wrote Les Miserables, and if you recall, the English translation to that is The Miserable Ones, talking about a very, very challenging and miserable time in French history. And yet this beautiful line comes out of that description, that this imagery comes from that book. And he says, "There is nothing like a dream to create the future. Utopia today, flesh and blood tomorrow. Pipe dream today, progress tomorrow." Because friends, isn't it true that any progress that we experience right now was once somebody's pipe dream? Was once an impossibility? That today's wildest dreams become tomorrow's reality? Because today's reality was once yesterday's wildest dreams. Is this not true? Right? A long time ago, someone once said, to the chagrin of all their peers, they said, one day, many people will poop inside the house. And everyone around them said, "You're crazy. That is a pipe dream." There you go. We're with me. I got him back. It took 15 minutes, but I got you back. All right. and I lost some of you forever. Friends, perhaps, though, this perspective means that if we are not audaciously optimistic today, that how are we supposed to expect a better tomorrow? Right? That if we don't look at the world today and we say there is no system, there is no way of doing things that is too powerful, that we cannot dream something better, if we don't have that perspective today, how do we expect that new reality to come into being? If we don't allow ourselves to entertain some utopias today, then how are we expecting to get to the flesh and blood tomorrow? Martin Luther King, he said, I have a dream. He did not say, I have a timeline or I have a perfect outline on how this is going to go. Jesus had a dream. He talked about the kingdom where the last shall be first and the first shall be last, the kingdom where the meek shall inherit the earth. This was a vision and a dream of a world to come. And the Buddha eloquently reminded us how we create that world. Chapter 1, verse 1 of the Dhammapada, a collection of Buddhist sayings, he says, with our thoughts we make the world, right? With our dreams, with our visions, with our intentions, we create tomorrow. That the great spiritual teachings, the ones that have remained with us for thousands of years, they invite us to choose a vision that is bringing us towards the greatest good. Optimism not as some kind of nice, warm and fuzzy approach, but as the real flesh and blood of how we create the future. It's how we do it. And none of this is determined by external events. None of this is denying suffering, right? Jesus, Martin Luther King Jr., deeply embedded in the suffering of their day, speaking from it and to it, and yet at the same time, they chose not to give in to pessimism. Because perhaps they learn, what I'm hoping that we're starting to learn today, that pessimism doesn't really have anything to offer you and I, except the illusion of control. You may be deeply disturbed out there about what's going on in the environment, about economic injustice. Again, fill in the blank, do your Mad Libs. But the frustrations that you feel, the disturbance that you feel, may actually reveal an optimism within. Hear me out. If you are feeling frustrated and disturbed and challenged by things that go on in the world today, perhaps it is only possible because the vision and the dream for something better exists within you. See, if you do not have a vision for how things could be better, how life could look, how we could collectively organize as a society, how we could better love each other and take care of each other and the planet, if you did not have a vision for this, then what would upset you about what you saw in the world today, right? If the way that we're doing things now was the best you could conceive of, then you would have no problem. So even in what you perceive as a pessimism or cynicism, it's actually masking a deeper optimism, right? Injustice implies justice. How could we recognize injustice if we did not have a deeper sense, even just buried in our hearts, of justice? How could you possibly say something's wrong if you do not have a conception of what right is? And so here's a big what if today. What if every time you are faced with a news clip or a reel or a post or a conversation that disturbs and frustrates you, what if instead of feeding despair, you fed the optimism, you saw it as actually a deep awareness and recognition in your own heart of what's possible and what could be better? That yes, there are moments to feel grief for a struggling world, and at the same time, perhaps that grief is also, on the flip side, a deep longing for the world that you know is possible. And perhaps following the grief, you can enter into that place of optimism. There's this wonderful indigenous concept, this idea, which wolf are you feeding? That at any moment, with every breath, with every thought, we are feeding two wolves, one of light, one of dark, one of ego, one of soul. Perhaps At any given moment, we are feeding despair or we are feeding the wolf of hope and optimism. Which wolf are you feeding? Are you feeding despair or are you feeding optimism? Now, friends, this is not in any way about being blindly hopeful or naively optimistic. This is about being intentional and strategic about protecting our present and safeguarding our future. That our present well-being may very well be determined by our outlook and our choice towards optimism. And in the same way, our future is too. Our children are waiting for us, right, and dependent on us to give them a reason for hope. And public intellectual Noam Chomsky, he thought of it as a strategy. Optimism is a strategy for making a better future. Or social justice author Mariam Kaba, hope is a discipline, strategy and discipline. Friends, this series, Ethos, about sacred values need to be chosen. That there is a strategy and a discipline to living our life in such a way that we are opting into a life of values. Remember the root of optimism, reminding us that we always have the option to choose values. We always have the option of what strategy for life we want to employ. Now, here's the reality. We've all felt it. Cynicism, skepticism, pessimism, and even depression, they seem to zap our ability to be optimistic. I know for me, in my low moments, it feels like my ability to see the options are clouded. My ability to choose values feels clouded. It feels far away. But even if you have no sense of power or no sense of choice, you will always have the choice to live and love in the direction of hope. And as Kathleen mentioned, a hope that could even survive the concentration camps. I'm reminded of author Viktor Frankl, who wrote the book Man's Search for Meaning, in his head, without a pen and paper, in a concentration camp. And this is really what he discovered, being put through that experience, living it so directly and concretely, and yet he remembered and gave to us this gift that when all choice is taken away, we still have one left. Everything can be taken from us but one thing, the last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. Perhaps optimism is a choice. And what are we willing to choose? Friends, your optimism is not your certainty of future events. It is your choice of how you're going to orient yourself towards each moment, even the worst and most difficult of moments. Friends, are you living as though you have skin in the game? Are you living, looking at the past and choosing to write your story, emphasizing the good? Are you living in such a way that you're giving the next generation a reason for hope? Are you planting apple trees that, even though tomorrow isn't promised? Are you willing to look at your frustration and not just see it as despair, but see it as awareness of what's possible and what's better in order to feed the wolf of hope rather than despair? Are you willing to adopt optimism, not as a feel-good approach, but as a cunning strategy and discipline for protecting today and ensuring tomorrow? I want to close with a quote from the poet John O'Donohue. He said, "The soul is a place where the eternal and time meet, where the future is still willing to emerge from the unknown." Friends, your very soul, your life, is the place from which the future is still emerging. And as long as it's still emerging, it is open, it is undecided, it is pregnant with possibility. And as long as that is true, hope and optimism have a place and have a purpose. So friends, may you be optimistic, not because of what's happening in the world, but because you choose to be.